when I was in university 2 decades ago, I was studying in Toronto and I was invited by some of the other students who I played hockey with to spend a week up in Attawapiskat in Northern Ontario to help run a hockey clinic. Now, Attawapiskat's a reserve. It's an Indigenous community of about 1,500 Mushkegowuk people. It's way up north. It's just west of James Bay, the body of water that's just at the bottom of Hudson's Bay. Just to get there, we drove 24 hours, first to Moose Factory, and then our van was loaded onto a train, which we took overnight to Moosonee. You can't actually drive into Attawapiskat for a lot of the year, but it was January, and so from Moosonee, we actually drove on a long and winding river that was frozen, like 4 feet thick, for a couple 100 kilometers. And when we were there, we slept in the community center at night and ran the coaching clinics on the rink with local teenagers, before school and then again after school, every day. It was like minus 30 all week. The roads between the houses were just icy snow. Snowmobiles were the main form of transportation, of course. And there were packs of somewhat feral huskies that were roaming everywhere that we actually had to be careful of. These teenagers were fantastic at hockey. And they had so much fun on the ice. And they played with such a joy, despite the fact it was the absolute coldest rink that I've ever been in. It was just a metal box without insulation, and in the middle of those crazy temperatures. And they welcomed us in during that week, with openness, kindness, cultural experiences, just throughout the community. Now, the residents of Attawapiskat face challenges that we probably don't equate with fellow residents of our province. Now, food is expensive for us these days, but the cost of food in Attawapiskat has always been astronomical. Before the prices went up these past few years, when the milk in Niagara cost $5, for example, in Attawapiskat it would cost $11. $10 ground beef here was $20 there. A case of 24 water bottles that we'd buy for $3, $37 in their community. Now, the water bottles in particular are significant because Attawapiskat, like many reserves, has problems with accessing clean water. A few years ago, they were forced to declare a state of emergency because of the quality of the water. And it wasn't like, the water tastes funny, or even like, it looks a bit brown coming out of the taps, which would be problematic enough. But in fact, it wasn't even simply a problem of being drinkable. Their water hadn't actually been drinkable for years. But at this point, it had gotten so bad that the people were being advised that they shouldn't bathe in the water for more than 3 minutes, and not to bathe in hot water at all, because it would open their pores and the chemicals would harm them more easily. And either way, the water emitted powerful or harmful chemical vapors into the air, and it made the air in people's houses toxic as well. We heard about various challenges facing the community while we were up there for the hockey clinic. While we expressed concern, sadness, we offered our sympathies. We played hockey as our contribution, went home and showed pictures of our adventure. For me, I'm ashamed to say, I generally forgot about Attawapiskat after my experience there, as good as it was for me, and as challenging were the things that I'd heard about. At least until about 10 years later. I was living overseas, but little Attawapiskat was in the news. It wasn't because of the impossible situation with their water. It's because of a crisis of suicides and suicide attempts by young community members. They had about 100 attempts over the course of a few months in this small community, 30 in 30 days at one point. You remember that? You might remember that being in the news. I remember having a moment after reading about this where I had kind of like a mental image, as if I was like looking at the globe, like as Google Maps, and kind of zoomed from where I was to Canada. And I just sort of looked at it, and it was like I'd never seen it before. I pictured the vastness of the country, and tiny Attawapiskat, with the faces of the incredible boys that I'd gotten to know for a few short days before carrying on with my life. And I couldn't fathom what they were facing, the despair that they were clearly feeling. and which I'd begun to understand was actually common among a disproportionate number of Indigenous youth. And as I observed my country, as if kind of for the first time, I thought, I haven't actually been seeing. I haven't been seeing what the Indigenous peoples and specific Indigenous persons, are experiencing right in the country that I've assumed I fully understood. I haven't recognized my role, my history in that experience. Now, before we continue, let's take a time out for a moment. We've been sharing stories and histories in this series as we've been looking at God's vision for the healing of the nations, as Tom shared with us in the first week. 2 weeks ago, Lori and Adrian shared with us about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the ways that we haven't lived into God's vision. The exposing of the tragedy of the residential school system that the church in Canada ran in the name of Jesus, and the devastating truths of what was done to Indigenous families and children for generations. Last week, Jeff led us into a discussion about the doctrine of discovery, which, as he taught us, is the legal and theological framework of dehumanizing Indigenous peoples for the express purpose of taking their land. That allowed and encouraged systems like the residential schools to exist and flourish as a Christian mission, a framework that has practical implications to this day. So as we're slowly learning, the harms and the brokenness in this history has unfolded over a long time, right? And there's a lot there, and it can feel overwhelming. But earlier this month, Adrian Jacobs said that Indigenous people are not trying to make somebody feel guilty, as he said. And even as he then said with a bit of a wry smile that Western Christians often feel guilty enough as it is. Instead, he said, the point of us knowing all of this is to be honest about the things and to call people into what he said was a responsible healing relationship. So I hope that you've been hearing the stories and teachings in this series not as an attempt to inspire feelings of shame, rather as an invitation to the freedom, as Jesus calls it, of truth. That's something that's worth saying at the end, but it's also worth saying right now. If you're hearing all of this and it's only inspiring shame, please release that. Because Jesus actually offers release of shame, not a compounding of it. Instead, hear the invitation to a freedom that you may not have even known that you were invited to experience on the other side of responding to these truths. Okay, so end of timeout. Now, one of the most significant moments in the history of Canada is actually the creation of the Treaty of Niagara. This agreement was at the start of the formal relationship between the British and First Nations of Canada. And it laid out the foundation building principles of how these nations, the nation of like European settlers, different First Nations, Indigenous communities, would actually behave towards each other. So the formation of this treaty happened in 1764, over 100 years before Canada even existed. Right at the lands at the mouth of the Niagara River, where it spills into Lake Ontario. It took place over the course of a month. And there were over 2,000 delegates from 24 First Nations that joined the British there. So together, assurances were made that the British would respect Indigenous sovereignty and territory. They agreed that no settlements would be made without permission from Indigenous communities. There were literal boatloads of gifts that were exchanged between different people there, and 84 wampum belts were exchanged, as traditional signs of peace and respect and agreement, respect for spirituality and shared values. These are like painstakingly created out of 10,000 tiny beads to reflect the importance of these agreements. The foundation of all these negotiations and the treaty that emerged lay in three basic principles that were agreed upon between everyone, Indigenous and settler. And they were peace, friendship, and respect. Now, these promises happened right here, like a few kilometers away. Now, In the story, which we read earlier in the service, Canada's Prime Minister is a young woman who, through a trusted secretary, finds this forgotten agreement, the Treaty of Niagara. Now, you may have recognized this as a retelling of a story from the Old Testament and from the book of 2 Kings, in which Judah's young king, Josiah, finds a dusty old book in the midst of renovating the neglected temple. He reads it and is overwhelmed by a devastating truth. God had partnered with his people, had clearly laid out a way of living in a good way, and they had made promises, a covenant together. But as Josiah now had the sickening realization, he and his people had been neglecting this covenant, this way of being and of behaving towards others, this relationship with God for generations. It tells us that Josiah is overcome and he tears his robes. That's an act of emotional grief. He's also expressing that grief in the symbolism of his culture. Tearing one's robes was a visible image of the invisible damage to one's heart that a person is showing that they had suddenly experienced or become aware of. It's also an exposing of nakedness. It showed that I've been exposed, by loss or grief or shame. I can't hide from what's real, whatever the embarrassment I feel. So Josiah tears his robes because he now knows a hard truth, and he knows that he's not going to hide from it. In the story of the young prime minister, after some research and digging around in the archives, the Treaty of Niagara is rediscovered. It had been hidden and it's dusty. It's been neglected and forgotten, just as in reality, its promises have been neglected, broken, forgotten. The parable speaks to the reality that we've been learning about through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the impacts of the doctrine of discovery and beyond. That is, the promises of peace and friendship and respect in the Treaty of Niagara and in the way of Jesus have largely not been honored. As we hear the stories of broken treaties and harmful systems, dehumanizing beliefs, and if we feel the classic deflection kind of bubbling to the surface, that wasn't me. And then even beyond the similarly classic response, yeah, but have you benefited from any of that? Please hear Jesus saying, you're answering a question that I haven't asked. I didn't ask if you did the most harmful acts. My question is, will you now see and love your neighbor? The young prime minister and Josiah, each received information that they chose to see as unignorable. And their two pieces of unignorable information combined to both be true for us today as well. There are some remarkable, groundbreaking promises of peace, of friendship, and respect that were made right here in Niagara between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples. And these were not upheld. And the Prime Minister wept. And God has made a covenant with God's people to partner with God to live in God's way of life, and this has been neglected. And Josiah tore his robes. But it doesn't end with the weeping and tearing of robes. They then share with their community. And once it's shared with the community, as it says in 2 Kings, then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. It's a communal act of holding each other accountable, to take these steps together. To now, together, pick up the treaty, the wampum belts that have been neglected. Because, by the way, it's another side note, when we found something that's true, and we can't keep it to ourselves, and we need to share it. That's what it means to be followers of Jesus, to be disciples of the one who is the way, the truth, the life. In the book of John, in the New Testament, we read that Andrew meets Jesus for the first time and spends the day with him. And then as he leaves, it says, the first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is, the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. The same is true when we experience Jesus now, when we see the way, the truth, and the life of Jesus in the places that Jesus calls us to, with the people that Jesus calls us to. We need to share that together and go there together, invite each other into those spaces. And I would suggest that when the Becoming Good Relatives team is inviting us to come and see, as you've heard, they're inviting us to spaces that they've experienced the invitation of Jesus, that invitation to truth and to reconciliation that leads to the peace of Christ. So, having received these truths that to us have become dusty, neglected, how do we respond? The first answer is we don't know. There isn't an exact formula, but like Josiah and the young prime minister, we want to choose to engage rather than ignore. And there are indicators of first steps that can allow us to see more. The calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission serve as a good starting point. As we've heard, the 5 calls to action that are specific to the church involves themes like, learning about the experiences of Indigenous peoples, listening to Indigenous peoples, financially supporting Indigenous-led initiatives towards healing, and then personalizing, both through rejecting and dehumanizing doctrines, and then adopting and humanizing covenants and friendships. In regards to call to action number 61, regarding financial support, a number of us from our community have been participating in some learning sessions with Indigenous Mennonite author and teacher Sarah Augustine about how to move towards financial reparations as a community, as a part of a healing process. A few Mennonite churches have taken the responsive step of creating a new covenant with local Indigenous groups regarding starting to contribute 1% of their annual budget towards local Indigenous-led healing programs. Is that something that we could move towards? And let's let this serve as a part of the start of that conversation as a community. We're hoping to discuss more of that together in the next year. And we're inviting each of us to start prayerfully considering, what it could look like for us as a church to take a financial step in that direction. In regards to learning about the experiences of Indigenous peoples, listening to Indigenous peoples and personalizing connection among Indigenous peoples, our Becoming Good Relatives team has been exploring this for themselves and on behalf of our church. And they'd like to invite us to join in. These invites are not formulaic and they're not overly complicated even, but they attempt to honor the intention of the calls to action, and in doing so, to reflect the ways of Jesus. So things like a book club, reading books by Indigenous authors. In this case, novels by Indigenous authors, talking about life and hopes and struggles and families and vacations and sharing these stories. We'll also be doing this learning by leaning into the storytelling of what's called a blanket exercise practice later this winter, which will physically walk us through the experiences of Indigenous peoples and settlers on the land. And we feel that everyone in our church should actually experience this powerful practice. So both of these are part of the work of learning, as beginning responses to call to action number 59. We also want to listen to the invitations from Indigenous peoples as a part of call to action number 60, which calls us to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right and to take responsibility to prevent spiritual violence. Here the invitation is to participate in spaces where we can listen, such as the Strawberry Thanksgiving next spring, the local powwow here next fall. Lastly, we want to lean into the personalizing invitations, humanizing, neighboring, kinship, leading to repudiating the doctrine of discovery and fully respecting Indigenous peoples, as we see in calls to action number 48 and 49. The current invitation towards this type of relational connection comes through the Niagara Regional Native Center in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And the invitation to attend their meal and drum circle evenings once a month, alongside two of our Becoming Good Relatives team members. And we're going to extend this invitation a little bit more specifically to you in a few moments. Now, friends, we've been hearing from teachers in different Indigenous communities who have said that it has taken generations to get to where we are today, in the separation and the harms that are present. And so it's going to take generations to repair and heal together as well. So instead of being incapacitated by the weight of it all, by our inability to know what to do, we're invited to simply start with the next faithful step towards reconciliation. And we all know the expression, a journey of 1,000 miles, kilometers, begins with a single step. The invitation that we believe that we're being invited to as followers of Jesus on this land is to take that first step. I personally still don't know what to do with the truths of the harms that Indigenous peoples have experienced. I mean, especially those experienced at the hands of Christian settlers, Mennonites, my people. But I'm now attempting to acknowledge the truth as I continue to learn about it. And in the midst of my internal apathy and even resistance, I also have an openness that I'm working towards to steps in my life, in the life of my family, and the life of my church community. And it's been a slow journey for me for the past number of years. But my reading has started to include books by Indigenous authors that have started to inform my perspective. Often with a sense of humor in the writing that really amazes me. My wife Taryn and I have had the chance to be in different circumstances that have started to teach us. Like the meals with the land defenders up at 1492 Landback Lane, or drum circles at the Niagara Regional Native Center. And we're seeing a slow change in our perspective, our values, our actions as Christians on Indigenous lands. Perhaps the most significant piece of this for me, for Taryn, is to see our three boys being raised in the perspective that we're slowly gaining. They hear stories of Indigenous peoples included in the books that we now read to them, and they now specifically bring books home that are similar from school, expanding and learning more. They spend time in contexts with us where Indigenous communities are real and active people, good people that they get to meet, rather than being solely shaped by the cultural forces of apathy and distance, which can create suspicion. Perhaps the Treaty of Niagara can be dusted off through our actions, and increasingly through the actions of our young ones. And it gives me hope that if I can slowly but steadily take ongoing steps towards truth and reconciliation, that the children of our community and the children of Indigenous neighbors and kin will have a new story to tell the next generations. Please, Jesus, may it be so. Amen.